Imagine the dreadful trenches of the Western Front in 1916, mud-choked ditches under relentless artillery fire, where men from all corners of the world huddled against the storm of war. Among them were thousands of black African soldiers, known as the Tirailleurs Senegalese riflemen, drawn from the vast expanses of French West Africa. These men, hailing from regions like Senegal, Mali, Guinea, and beyond, were not volunteers in the romantic sense. They were the human fuel for France's desperate war machine. Over 200,000 African troops served France in World War I, with more than 135,000 fighting in Europe alone. Their story is one of extraordinary valor overshadowed by exploitation, discrimination, and ultimate betrayal. This is the factual account of how they were used as expendable assets, abused through racial hierarchies, betrayed in the peace that followed, and, in some cases, executed to enforce discipline. Their sacrifices helped save France, but France often turned its back on them. France entered World War I in 1914 with grand ambitions but quickly faced a manpower crisis. The bloody stalemate on the Western Front devoured soldiers at an alarming rate. Over 1.4 million Frenchmen would die by war's end. To replenish its ranks, France turned to its colonial empire, particularly French West Africa, where the Tirailleurs Senegalese had been established as a corps in 1857 under Napoleon III. Initially created for colonial conquests in Africa, these units were later repurposed for use in the European theater. Recruitment was far from voluntary. While some men enlisted for pay, adventure, or promises of French citizenship, many were coerced through a system blending quotas, conscription, and outright force. In 1915, as the war dragged on, French authorities launched massive drives across West Africa. Colonial administrators, aided by local chiefs, imposed enlistment targets on villages. Men aged 18 to 35 were rounded up, sometimes at gunpoint. In Senegal alone, resistance was fierce. Around 15,000 men fled into the bush or across borders to evade drafts. Armed uprisings erupted, like the 1915 rebellion in Beladougou, modern-day Mali, where locals fought back against recruitment officers, only to be crushed by French forces. By 1918, France had raised 93 new Senegalese battalions, with 42 deployed to France. These soldiers were trained minimally, often just enough to handle rifles and follow orders, and shipped across the Atlantic or Mediterranean. They were integrated into regiments mixed coloniaux, mixing African tirailleurs with white French colonial infantry. This structure was strategic. Africans were often placed in the front lines as shock troops, absorbing the brunt of assaults. French commanders viewed them as hardy and fearless, stereotypes rooted in racial pseudoscience that portrayed black Africans as natural warriors impervious to fear or cold. Ironically, the same myths that led to their exploitation. Their roles extended beyond the trenches. Tirailleurs served in key offensives, like the Battle of the Marne in 1914, where early contingents helped halt the German advance. But their primary use was in high-risk operations. At Verdun in 1916, Senegalese units endured months of hellish fighting, charging into no man's land against machine guns and gas. Casualty rates were staggering. About 30,000 African soldiers died in Europe, a disproportionate toll given their numbers, roughly 2% of France's total dead, but from a force that was only about 3 to 4% of the army. They were tools in France's survival strategy, used to plug gaps in the line, preserve metropolitan French lives, and project imperial might. Despite the odds, the Tirailleurs Senegalese fought with remarkable bravery, earning decorations and respect from allies. Their combat history in World War I is a testament to resilience amid horror. Upon arrival in France, they traded colorful colonial uniforms for practical khaki, adapting to the industrialized slaughter of modern warfare. One of their first major engagements was at Ypres in 1914, where Senegalese battalions reinforced Belgian and French lines against German assaults. In the Champagne Offensive of 1915, they charged fortified positions, suffering heavy losses but gaining ground. The Moroccan Division, which included Senegalese units, became legendary for its ferocity at the Battle of Artois, earning the nickname the Shock Division. In 1916, at the Somme, Tirailleurs advanced under withering fire, capturing objectives that white units had failed to take. Eyewitness accounts describe them fixing bayonets and shouting war cries, drawing on African traditions to steel themselves. The 1917 Nivelle Offensive at Chemin de Dames saw intense involvement. Senegalese troops assaulted heavily defended ridges, facing gas attacks and barbed wire. Their efforts contributed to temporary gains, but at a cost. Entire battalions were decimated. In the Levant and Salonika fronts, they fought Ottoman forces, enduring malaria and harsh terrain. By 1918, during the 100 Days Offensive, surviving Tirailleurs pushed back the Germans, helping force the armistice. Individual stories highlight their heroism. Blaise Diagne, Senegal's first black deputy in the French Parliament, championed recruitment but also advocated for the troops. Units like the 1st Regiment of Senegalese Tirailleurs received the Forager in 1919 for multiple citations. Yet, their fighting was shaped by how they were used, often in human wave tactics where their lives were deemed less valuable. German propaganda exacerbated this, labeling them savages and accusing them of atrocities to justify the mistreatment of captured Africans. In reality, when taken prisoner, Tirailleurs faced starvation and abuse in German camps, with some denied medical care due to racist policies. The abuses faced by black African soldiers were systemic, rooted in France's colonial racism. While French propaganda portrayed them as loyal children of France, reality was harsher. Recruitment itself was abusive. Families lost breadwinners, villages were disrupted, and resistors were punished. Once in service, Tirailleurs endured segregation. They were paid less than white French soldiers, about half the rate, and received inferior rations, often lacking meat or wine staples given to Europeans. Racial stereotypes dictated treatment. French officers believed Africans couldn't handle European winters, so from 1915 onward, Tirailleurs were wintered in southern France or North Africa from October to April, housed in camps near Marseille or Fréjus. While this spared them some trench duty, it isolated them and reinforced notions of inferiority. White troops envied this privilege, but it stemmed from pseudoscience claiming Africans were prone to pneumonia in cold weather, a myth debunked by their actual performance. In combat, abuses were deadly. Tirailleurs were disproportionately assigned to dangerous assaults, seen as expendable. Medical care was subpar. Wounded Africans often waited longer for treatment. Socially, they were barred from mingling with French civilians to prevent racial defilement, echoing German fears. French authorities feared romantic liaisons, leading to strict controls. Some Tirailleurs faced sexual exploitation or were used in propaganda films as exotic curiosities. Discipline was brutal. The French army executed around 600 soldiers during World War I for mutiny or desertion, and colonial troops were not spared. In December 1914, a unit of Algerian Tirailleurs, North African, but including some sub-Saharan elements, refused a suicidal counterattack. French commanders decimated them, executing 1 in 10 at random, killing several black and Arab soldiers. Similar incidents occurred with Senegalese units. During the 1917 mutinies, which swept the French army after failed offensives, some Tirailleurs joined protests over poor conditions. At least a few were court-martialed and shot, though exact numbers for black soldiers are obscured in records. These executions were meant to set examples, disproportionately affecting colonials perceived as less loyal. Off the battlefield, abuses continued. Captured by the Germans, Tirailleurs suffered from racist treatment. Denied Red Cross parcels, forced into labor, or subjected to medical experiments. German pamphlets accused them of barbarism, fueling hatred that led to summary killings of wounded Africans. As the guns fell silent in 1918, the betrayal began. France hailed its victory but swiftly disposed of its African saviors. Tirailleurs were repatriated en masse, often within months, to prevent integration into French society. Promises of citizenship or land grants evaporated. Only a handful, like originaries from Senegal's 4 communes, retained rights. Most returned as colonial subjects without voting rights or equality. Pensions were a stark betrayal. African veterans received fractions of what white French soldiers got, sometimes as little as 1/5. These meager sums were frozen after African independence in the 1950s and 1960s, unadjusted for inflation, while French pensions rose. It wasn't until 2006 that President Jacques Chirac partially addressed this. But by then, most veterans had died in poverty. Their contributions were erased from history. Monuments in France rarely mentioned tirailleurs. Schoolbooks glossed over them. In Africa, returning veterans faced suspicion from colonial authorities, who feared they might spark unrest with tales of equality seen in Europe. Some did. Veterans like Lamine Senghor organized anti-colonial movements in the 1920s, linking World War I service to demands for rights. The ultimate disposal came in cultural amnesia. France whitened its army narrative, downplaying colonial roles. This echoed in World War II, where similar patterns repeated, culminating in events like the 1944 Tirailleurs massacre. Though that's a later chapter, it stemmed from World War I-era inequalities. The Tirailleurs Senegalese story is a microcosm of colonialism's cruelty. Used as tools in a European war, abused through racism, betrayed in victory, and executed when discipline demanded. Yet, their legacy endures. They proved Black Africans' capability, challenging stereotypes and sowing seeds for decolonization. Today, memorials like the Reims Monument honor them, and figures like Emmanuel Macron have acknowledged their role. But full reckoning requires remembering not just their fights, but the systemic wrongs. These men didn't just fight for France. They exposed its hypocrisies, paving the way for a freer Africa.